Hello friends, in the last lesson while you were creating table columns, you have probably noticed we have not-null primary key things here. So there are constraints, and on this video we are going to talk about them, about table constraints, and we will use some of them. So, while the data types are a mandatory part of a column definition, constraints are optional. That's why we were able to create columns without even using them. However, we were forced to set data types for each and every column. Even though constraints are optional, they are extremely useful. And more often than not, you will want to add some kind of constraint to your columns. Okay, so what are those keys and constraints? Keys and constraints are rules that define what data values are allowed in certain columns. Actually, these two are part of the database design process and ensure that the data within a database is reliable and maintains its integrity, both used to prevent invalid data from being entered into the database. Constraints can apply to a specific column, an entire table, more than one table, or an entire schema. The following are commonly used constraints available in Postgresql. The first two in our list are keys. Keys are a special type of constraint used to establish relationships and uniqueness. We have two types of keys, primary keys and foreign keys. They can be used to identify a specific row in the table or to refer to a specific row in another table. We will talk more about these keys in the lesson about relationships in the database. But for now about foreign keys, just remember the foreign keys are a special type of constraint to establish relationships and used to refer to a specific row in another table. However, now about the primary keys. A primary key constraint is a unique identifier for a row of data. Often, a unique identification number such as an ID number, a serial number, password number, or code serves as a primary key in a table. It is a good practice to add a primary key to every table. So every single table we ever make is going to have a primary key. However, you might notice that up to this point in this course we have not created any tables with a primary key. But no worries, we're going to fix it in a second. We're going to give all our tables primary keys. So let's quickly open up pgadmin here. So here the first table, the category table. Right-click on the table and click Properties and go to the Columns section. A table can have only one primary key, which may consist of a single column or a group of columns. When multiple columns are used as a primary key, they are called a composite key. But for now, let's focus on a single column primary key. Note, often an identity column or simply an ID column is used as a primary key as it is guaranteed to be unique. But often doesn't mean always. So let's add the ID column here and define its type, big-int, since there are going to be saved a lot of different categories from different users here. We could use small int for example here, but you remember from the data types lesson, it has a small range. Now we're going to make it the primary key by answering this question. Yes. And save. Now we need to refresh to be able to see the ID column. Let's go here, refresh, and expand the category table, expand columns. Here you go, we have the ID column here. And if we go to the constraints and expand it, we are gonna see category primary key constraint here. Let's take a look at the table data by following these steps. Right click on table, go to View Data, All Rows. We know that the table is empty. We're going to add some example data and test our primary key. The goal of a primary key is to identify an individual row inside of a table. Every value inside of this column is going to be a unique value in that column. We made the ID field primary key, so its goal now is to uniquely identify this row inside of a table. Its value is always unique and it's never ever going to change. So let's add a category. For example, family. Okay. And its ID is going to be 1. Okay. And save it by clicking on this Save Data Changes. Great. So now let's add a second category. Let's name it sport. Okay. And try to set the ID again 1. And store. Here you go, you see an error as we are trying to violate rule, the unique constraint. If we change this ID to 2 or 3, whatever, and save, we will successfully save it. I think you got the idea. Now let's follow the same steps and define primary key for other 3 tables. With category table we are done, let's go to priority table, properties, columns. Let's add the identifier here, ID. It is again big int. Let's make it primary key, save. The next table is task, the same steps. ID, big int, and primary key, save. And the last one is user info. Let's do the same thing. ID, big int, primary key, and save. Great. So some notes here about primary keys. We should apply a few rules when choosing a primary key for each table. The primary key must uniquely identify each record. We already said this. We just confirmed that the ID is uniquely identifying each record. It must remain stable. We can't change the primary key fields. It should be simple and contain as few attributes as possible. So our IDs are very simple, it's just one attribute. It must exist when the record is created. For now, we are manually adding ID values like 1 and 3. Soon we will find a way so the value of primary key will always exist at the time of the record is created. And the last rule is a primary key value can't be null. Even though we have not applied this rule, a primary key value can't be null rule, pgadmin did it for us. Let's try to add a category of, say, films. Okay. And leave the ID field empty, just like this. And store. We got an error related to a not-null constraint. This is because we made the ID column primary key and pgadmin also applied a not-null constraint for us. Let's check it out quickly. Categories, right-click, properties, we go to the column section. Here you go. This not-null constraint is applied for the ID column. We did not do anything. It's just coming from pgadmin. So what is a not-null constraint? Let's come back for a second to our presentation now. Look at the third constraint we have here. It is not-null constraint. This type of constraint is used to make sure that the column cannot have a null value. In the database, null means nothing, an empty value, an unknown value. Some people sometimes confuse number 0 and null for integer column. Null does not take up space in the database, but the number 0 does. You know, by default, any column can hold null values. We saw it in the examples. But if you do not want a column to have a null value, then you need to define a not-null constraint on that column. Now I go back to pgadmin and show you some examples there. Go to tables and for example, let's check out user info table and see if we need to define any not-null constraints on its columns. Right-click, properties, and go to columns. Okay. In our application, all users should have username, password, and email. Otherwise, they cannot log in and use the application. So these columns can't be empty. These columns can't be null. We can't have users that have a null password or null username, am I right? Here we have this question, not null. If we clicked on this, it would mean we answered yes, and we defined not null constraint on this column that is username. By setting up this, we make sure anytime we insert a new user, the column username must be defined. We have to provide some value there. Let's test this column and compare with the password column that does not have not null constraint yet. Save here. Okay, let's view user info table data. All rows. Here you go. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is to add a new user, a new row, and we will leave the username, email, password all empty. I mean, let's add one here for the identifier for the primary key and save. But we cannot do that. Here you go, you see, we have this error, null value in column username. It's just because we just defined a not null constraint on this column. Now let's try to add something here, and okay, and save it. And we successfully saved the new user, even though the email and password columns are empty. Now let's remove this newly added row. I will tell you in the next lesson why we are doing so. And save. Okay, the next step is we have to add not null constraints for the email and password columns. Okay, let's define it by just answering to this question, not null. Yes, yes, and save. Okay, once we are done, we will come here and we will try to add a new user, and the same thing. We will again try to leave this email and password empty and try to save it. We cannot do that because we have just defined not null constraint on these columns. Now we will add something here and something here and try to save it. Here you go, the data saved successfully. As you saw, if we don't provide any value for columns, null was set, because a null value represents some kind of unknown data. So in Postgresql, if no default value is declared explicitly, the default value is the null value. And we have just confirmed it. How about if we want to make sure that a column cannot have a null value, even though users do not provide a value, we set a default value different from null? Yes, we can do that. We can do it again from the columns section. For example, let's take this task table, go to the properties and columns, and let's start looking at this default column here. But before, just one note, not setting the default value and letting it accept null is okay, if you can't give a default value that makes sense. It is also okay to force users to provide data to be able to save the new entry. For example, the title here. Title column cannot be null, and giving a default value does not make any sense and is not correct. Here users must provide it, otherwise the task can't be stored. However, for the completed column, we could give actually the default value false. It means when a new task is inserted, by default its state will be not completed if you don't set the completed value. Or even for created on, we could set the function now as a default value. So when we create and don't define when it was created, it will pick the time it was created. We will talk about function in the future lessons, don't sweat it. Let's set these two values and try to add some task here. We're going to save it. Now let's go and check the task table data. Go view data, all rows. Okay, now let's check out the default value that we have just defined for completed and created columns. Add a new row here. Okay, say the ID is going to be 1 and the title, some title. Okay, and let's leave the other two columns empty and save data. Here you go, we got as a default value false for the completed, so the task by default is not completed. And for the created on column, we've got the time that the task was created. Cool, now you know how to use the default value. So now let's go and define not-null constraint for the columns of other tables. Let's go to the task, properties, columns. Okay, so here we have to set this to actually 3 not-null constraints here and save it. Great. The next one is property. Let's do it quickly here. Not null and not null title. Yes, these columns are all required. And then the last one is category. So we cannot create a category without title. That makes sense. So let's make it not null. Great, and save it. So the next constraint, The next constraint is the unique constraint. It prevents any duplicate values from being entered into a column. This is particularly useful when creating usernames, unique identities, or any primary key. Sometimes you want to ensure that the values stored in a column or even a group of columns are unique across the whole table, such as email addresses or usernames. So, with Postgresql unique constraint, we can maintain the uniqueness of the data correctly. When a unique constraint is in place, every time you insert a new row, it checks if the value is already in the table or not. It rejects the change and issues an error if the value is already in the table. If you recall, we gave a similar definition to primary key. We said it is a unique identifier for a row of data. But there are some key differences between the primary key and the unique key. The primary key constraint does not allow you to store null values, whereas with the unique key, we can save nulls. A table can have only one primary key, but we can define multiple unique constraints. The primary key does not allow you to delete or modify the data. On the other hand, a unique constraint does. The primary key's purpose is to enforce entity integrity, whereas the unique constraint purpose is to enforce unique data only. Actually, making a column primary key is essentially equivalent to adding not null, a unique constraint to that column. Okay, enough about it. Let's go to the pgadmin and see some examples for unique constraint. Okay, in my opinion, only for the user info table columns, we could add this constraint, the unique constraint, and it would make sense. Yeah, but for example, there is no need to use unique constraint in the task table. Let's see the task table here, open up here the columns. Yeah, the title, different users can add a different task with the same title. The same thing for the completed and the created on. So we cannot use this unique constraint here. However, if you go to the user info table here and to the column section, you will see username. So we don't want users having the same username in our system. So that's why we can define unique constraint for the username. There are actually two options to do so. One is we can do it from the constraints here. We will go to the unique and we start adding here the unique constraint here. We will give it the name and we will add the column here. But I will show you the quicker way of doing so. We will go to the user info. As you know, we have the constraints, list of constraints. So far, we have added only primary key for the username table. So let's right click here, create, and go to unique constraint. Great. Here, if you want, we will give a name. But if you don't give, pgadmin will generate one for you. So let's select the username here and click save. Here we go. Here we see the newly added unique constraint here. So let's go now and see the data in this table. Like always, we keep our tables clean for now. Yeah, it is clean. We don't have anything. So now let's add a username dev. And let's add something for now. Email and password, we can add whatever we want. And the ID is 1. Great. And save it. Cool. Now let's try to add another username with the same, another user with the same username, dev. And here again, whatever one we can edit here. And 2. Okay. And let's try to save it. Here you go. You will see this error. Duplicate key value violates unique constraint. So you see, we have an error related to the unique constraint that we have just defined. Great, I think you got the idea. We can do the same thing for the user's email. Save. And now click refresh. Here you go, we will see the second unique constraint. One more thing, if you click here and try to create primary key, we cannot do that. Because I told you a table can have only one primary key. That's why we don't have this option available here. So the next constraint in our list is check constraint. PostgreSQL check constraint controls the value of a column or columns being inserted. It evaluates the conditions specified in the definition of the check constraint. If the values pass the check, PostgreSQL will insert or update these values to the column. Otherwise, Postgres will reject the change and issue a constraint violation error. So now let's go to pgadmin to see at least one example there. Honestly, I have not planned to add any check constraint in our table columns here, but I can show you one example here. Let's go to the task table, expand columns here. Okay, here we have the created on column. The check constraint that we are going to add will prevent users from using dates before 1st of January 2000. Okay, to add this constraint, what we will do, we will go to the constraints here, right click, create, and go to check. Great. We will leave the name empty. We want pgadmin to generate this constraint name for us. Go to the definition, and here we go. Here what we will do, we will say created on should be greater, and here 2001 and save. Great. We see the newly created constraint here. Now let's go to the tasks data here. Show up the data here. Okay, let's go and add a new row here. Just whatever, anything, any title, completed. Let's leave it as it. ID 2. And let's focus on this column. Let's say it is 9. Okay, it is 1999, and try to save it. Here we go. We got a check constraint related error here. So I think you got the idea. It was just an example, and now I'm going to remove it because I don't want any check constraint on this column here. Yes, great. And now about the last constraint in our list, exclusion constraint. If a check constraint evaluates an expression based on a single row of the table, the exclude constraint evaluates a comparison of 2 rows in the table. We will not go in deep here because we don't know indexes yet, so let's leave it for the future lessons. Okay, great. That's enough for this lesson. See you in the next video.